Hello and welcome to the webinar. Grab that cup of coffee, grab your notepad, and make sure you have a pen ready. Don't forget to submit any questions you have in the control panel. In this webinar, we'll start discussing the security and access top tips for Magento merchants. Magento websites are under constant attack from hackers, fraud, and legal action, making it difficult for merchants to keep up. Today, experts in Magento Security, fraud, and ADA compliance team up to share merchant stories and give you the facts that can save your store from disaster. Stay tuned until the end of the webinar to get a look at our security bundle. SiteImprove, Signifyd, and Redstage work together to create the perfect bundle for Magento merchants who need extra security against various threats that we'll talk about in today's webinar. Now, I'll introduce today's speakers. First, we have myself, Don Pingaro from Redstage. I'm joined by Peter from Signifyd, Corb from SiteImprove, and Scott from Suez Water Technologies. How's everybody doing?
I'm great. How about you?
Hey,
Good.
Donald. Thanks. This is Peter. I'm doing great. Appreciate it.
Appreciate the time.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us again. All right, Scott, why don't you start off by telling us about your experiences with ADA compliance?
So currently I work for a company called Suez Water Technology Solutions. In my previous role, I was the technical product owner for all of our transactional websites globally. Brand websites did not fall under my purview. However, I had a counterpart who was responsible for our brand websites. We had a number of lawsuits levied against some of the brands that this company owned for these sites not being ADA compliant. Sites that didn't contain alt tags, sites that didn't meet the ADA compliance criteria. Some of these lawsuits were settled, some of these lawsuits were dropped. This company that I'm referring to is a Fortune 500 company. They own a bunch of brands, and it was a costly exercise in time, effort, and a lot of aggravation, especially phone calls with C-level executives on Fridays and Saturdays and weekends and late nights. In 2019, earlier this year, the same company had a lawsuit levied against them for a transactional website. This lawsuit carried some more teeth, I'll say, because this is a site that actually generated revenue. I don't know how this lawsuit turned out. I had left the company prior to this lawsuit either being settled or ending up in court. It could still potentially be there. I don't know how it turned out. However, through both of these multiple websites, both for brand informational sites and transactional sites happening, it became a mad scramble first to get all the transactional websites ADA compliant. We leveraged a technology like SiteImprove to help that happen in order to bring that compliance piece from an ADA perspective up to speed. So now I will hand it to Corb to talk a little bit more about ADA compliance.
Thanks, Scott. You know, I think you're right in that a lot of the reason that we start to talk about accessibility is because of litigation. And today I want to challenge everyone to think about not think about our customers as we have our typical customers and we have our customers with disabilities. We just have customers. You know, earlier this year, there's a group called WebAIM out of the University of Utah State University. And they looked at 1 million websites, homepages. And these are the 1 million most popular homepages on the web. And they found that 97.8% of these websites had failures against the International Standard for Accessibility. But more importantly than that, fewer than 1% of these pages were actually compliant, right? Because only so much of accessibility can be tested automatically. On average, 1 out of every 13 elements of a homepage posed an accessibility barrier for a customer. That's lost revenue for most of us because that means that a customer is not able to make that purchase. So that means we count up all the different things, links, headings, form fields, every element that's holding content. And we want to see how many of those failed. That was 1 in every 13. And that's on your homepage. So today, I want to talk about these real people. And I think so often it's easy for us to think about users who are blind, right? We think about screen reader users and lawsuits from screen reader users. But let's not forget that we have a lot of customers who are very diverse. We have customers with low vision. We have customers who fall off horses and break their arms, myself included. We have customers who are deaf or hard of hearing, or those who have a learning disability. And so today, let's talk about alt text, because that is the #1 most common issue on websites. This is, you have an image, a screen reader user, there is some artificial intelligence out there that'll help them understand what that image is, but we can do better than that. And let's take this up a notch from what we've said in the past. Let's give the 2019 version of alt text. Let's talk about well-labeled forms, clear prices in our shopping carts, and if you stay just with me for a few minutes, I'll give you your secret weapon, no matter how accessible your site is today. So on the web, we would never tolerate it if our homepage or a part of our site, our product images, looked like this, a broken image. But yet, we don't always think about a screen reader user who's going to hear a broken image as image, or DSC 2248 GPG image, right? Or button, image, button. This is how a lot of the web looks today for somebody who is navigating with a screen reader. My son, he's 4 years old, and he really loves strawberries. He loves them in his cereal, in his lunch, just fresh out of the fridge at midnight. I mean, he loves them. My wife and I are both blind, and it's just super convenient. Like so many other people, we love grocery delivery. And so we said, you know what? He's been talking about strawberries. Let's order these strawberries. We were all so excited. And instead, what arrived were these strawberries, frozen strawberries. Now, I don't know if you know how messy a 4-year-old can get when they're eating. Strawberries are messy enough, but frozen strawberries, right? He had them in his lunch, he had them in his hair, on his hands, and most of all, he was just really disappointed. And disappointed 4-year-olds are no fun. Disappointed parents of 4-year-olds are even less fun. So here we have both strawberries, both maybe the same quantity, the same weight, and yet the only way that you would know the difference between these two is by the image. And so we need to make sure that when we're talking about alternative text for users, that we're not just satisfying a legal requirement. We're making it clear to our users what is it that that image contains. And the way that we can do that, now labeling every image, all of your 30,000 SKUs could be a challenge. But what if we were to put this in the content of the title? If we merely added fresh strawberries or frozen strawberries? What about if we're using the images to convey things like the nutrition facts? We don't necessarily have to put all of that into one paragraph of alternative text. Let's find a way to on the site to maybe have that information elsewhere. Now, this sounds easy to add alternative text to images, but it gets complex very quickly. That doesn't mean that it's not important to customers like me, who really want to make sure that we're buying the right kind of strawberries. Fortunately for me, my wife was the one doing shopping, so it wasn't on me that the disappointment, but nonetheless, still a problem. Let's move on to talk about forms. This is a really common concept on the web, right? We want really clean UI. We want to make sure that somebody who's filling out a form, there's not a lot of clutter in their way. And so we're going to make it so that the label is right inside the form. It doesn't have to look old school. And here's what happens. So I'm going to type in my email address here. And let's say I've generated an error, right? me@invalid. is not a valid email address by any means. And so what do a lot of sites do? They just turn it red. Well, in addition to being blind and using a screen reader, I'm also colorblind. So I have no idea what's going on and why this form won't submit. And I think to myself, well, maybe it wasn't my email address. Maybe they wanted my phone number. I don't know anymore because that label has disappeared. Same thing goes for here. Okay, I fixed my email address now, but now I clicked on first name and maybe I have a traumatic brain injury or a learning disability. And I say, what was I supposed to do here? I don't know. I've got this blinking cursor in this empty text field. What did they want from me? And so we can move to something that looks like this. Now, this looks very clean, very obvious, very clear, maybe a little bit older in its practice, but older and more robust is something that's really important in accessibility. Here we have forms that are the label is always visible. It's connected to the form elements. We're not using placeholder text, and we're using a method other than color to convey error messaging, right? We might have an error message in text atop the form or right below that field that's in question. So let's move on and talk about prices for a second. So here's an item. You're looking at it with a screen reader, and it tells you about this great product. You're interested, and it says price, $40.96, $29.95. So which is correct? Take a minute. Which one would you think is correct? I mean, it would make sense that sale price, so I guess it would be cheaper. But I'm a student of economics. I love elasticity. This actually is an example of surge pricing. Now, you might not have known that because you just saw two prices, and you didn't have the added benefit of a sighted person who can see that this is crossed out. You're using a screen reader. You're just navigating it based on what you see there on the page. So what we could do is we could add some text before that. This could be off-screen text typically, and you must say current price, colon, and leave the text showing. Regular price, and leave that text showing. You can style it however you like, but better yet, why not add this as on-screen text? Benefit everybody. Make it really clear, because quite frankly, just seeing that one line crossed out of the $29.95 be pretty. You wouldn't be. I wouldn't misfault you if you just looked right past it and said, "Oh, price is this." Speaking of prices, decimal points really matter. We were testing an app just last week, and this is what we saw. 40.96, right? The 96 is a superscript. Well, that's easy enough. Sounds great. A screen reader read that as $4,096. That was a really expensive product for a screen reader user, and not too expensive for somebody not navigating with a screen reader. Easily solved. You can keep this design, right? As you might know from the pattern of what we've been talking about, keep the pattern visually. Just add that decimal point as a hidden item between those two. Your developer should know how to do that, and make sure that that's the case for all of your products where you're using these more modern design elements. But there is a secret weapon. So in all the work that you're going to do to make your site accessible, you're going to use automated testing. You're going to test it manually, but all of that takes time to implement. And so, the one thing that works really well for almost everyone, the old-fashioned telephone. Now, I purposely am not showing you a image of an iPhone, though, because I want to make clear, we are talking about literal phones through the copper wires with humans answering them. And it's important because when your customers run into trouble, they're not just going to be your blind customers. It's going to be your customers of any kind who's wondering, why can't I buy this item? Why won't it let me check out? Hey, I can't seem to figure out why my billing address isn't accepted. I swear, my address doesn't have a lane, street, road, boulevard, parkway in it, and your system won't allow it. And then when I come across an accessibility barrier, I know that there's somebody who I can reach out to who cares, who's received some training about blind users and what it means when I say I can't navigate your site with a screen reader, because you've taken the time to train your call center staff. I know you're not going to charge me extra, because really our goal is to just get that product purchased. So as we've talked about, these are the important elements of your checkout flow to make sure that those are more usable by folks with disabilities. When I was working at a design agency, I talked to a UX person who said, you're always telling us about accessibility. Remember, nobody who works in the field of user experience design wants to develop a bad user experience. We all want it to be positive. So let's make sure that when we think about accessibility, we're talking about real people, real customers, all of our customers. We're building one experience that's inclusive for everyone and that addresses the needs of a very diverse audience. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right, so hey everybody, this is Scott Wueschinski again. So here I'm going to change gears a little bit and kind of set the stage for the fraud conversation. So again, I used to work for a merchant that sold multiple brands. And here's a pretty slick fraud case that burned one of these brands for a significant amount of money that you can see from the site. So in February of February of 2019, these fraudsters were perpetrating what's called triangular fraud. Triangular fraud is depicted by the diagram on the right-hand side. So here you have a fraudulent seller selling real products, real widgets. I'll pick something from the image above, whatever they may be, real Jacob's crackers on Amazon. So I'm selling these crackers on Amazon. What happens then is, say Corb goes and buys these crackers on Amazon. I collect the money from Amazon. Amazon holds the money for a period of time. I now go to the Jacob's Crackers website, buy the Jacob crackers on their website, and ship them to Corb at his real address, 2-day air. So Corb gets expedited shipping, he gets the real product, but I have bought the products on the Jacob's Cracker website with stolen credit cards from the dark web that were purchased, using some email address that was created via Gmail, and then that payment from that stolen credit card then will get charged back at some point by the real card holder. So it started small. It's basically called probing. So the site was probed. The multiple purchases were made, hundreds of them. That was in February. In March, there was a couple of fraud alerts. The credit card processor reached out to someone in that business specifically. That person didn't act on that information, which is supposed to be a fail-safe, some person interacting with it. And then what happened was the end of April, the third week of April, they automated that process. They wrote a script that were basically taking these items that were purchased on Amazon that they were selling, going to this merchant website, using stolen credit cards that you put in a file, and it's pulling these stolen credit cards, using Gmail's API to create unique email addresses for every purchase, and took the site for $500,000 in 10 days. So then you say, all right, whatever, Amazon has the money. Well, you can take money out of Amazon. There's basically like cash cards that you set up with, that are set up with an ACH and a bank number. And it's basically, once the money's on that card, it's gone because you take it out of that card. So you pay a 2.5% fee for that. So they got popped for $500,000 in 10 days. The total loss or so was about $800,000 in top line sales. It cost them about $400,000 in actual cost of goods loss. And then because their chargeback rates were so high, what then happened was Visa, MasterCard, and Amex levied dollar for dollar fines on them, which brings the hard cost loss up to about 1.4 million. Hundreds of hours, thousands of hours by my development team, by external audit companies, looking at the process, looking at where the failures were. And then what happened was this e-commerce business then became the subject of a company-wide audit, which was being performed by Accenture. Very painful, very unpleasant experience for myself, having to explain what happened to C-level executives, CEO, CFO, and the board of directors. So yeah, pretty awful experience. So I'm going to now pass it to Peter to talk some more about fraud.
Thank you, Scott. That is actually a story that is eye-opening to me. I think it's something that I think a lot of merchants on the line might want to ask, what if this happens to your business? Will you even survive? There was a lot of costs involved and a lot of headaches. What are some of the things that you can do about it? Well, you can use a solution like Signifyd, and you can go to Redstage and sign up for their security bundle. And solution like Signifyd, if had something like Signifyd been in place, then I'll show you in this presentation. Essentially, the company would have been protected against those losses. But before I talk about Signifyd, I want to talk about essentially the total cost of fraud globally as it impacts. You talked about hard costs of about $1.5 million for, a very sophisticated fraud attack essentially working in a triangle. Well, this is not the first time I've heard that story. And some companies, if they get hit by this, essentially they can't operate their business because of this third-party selling structure, essentially, right? Because you can't essentially, go to Amazon and tell them not to list a certain product or anything like that. You can only really control your own site. So where's the way to interrupt that? And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But first, I'd like to start off by saying, really, what does fraud cost all of us as merchants, right? In general, right now, with some statistics that are pretty recent, in 2020, there will be $4.1 trillion in global e-commerce. But what does that mean in terms of total costs for fraud? On average, merchants lose about 0.9% on average, some more, some less. The 0.9% of their revenue is tied up and essentially by fraudulent chargebacks and such from their business. So almost 1% of their revenue is fraudulent across the board. In some countries, it's very high, particularly like Latin American countries or even in EMEA, those fraud rates can be much higher, but generally in the United States, it hovers at almost 1% of revenue for every merchant. Like I said, some higher, some lower. Another aspect or cost for fraud is that another 1% is actually spent on countermeasures. It's kind of funny. People use software and solutions and people to deploy countermeasures to stop fraud, and that's almost as much as the cost of fraud. And companies put those in place. And like I said, that takes up another 1% of revenue. So about 2% of your revenue is kind of tied up essentially to the cost of fraud. And then the largest impact, which is a revenue impact, is when people deploy these countermeasures, they wrongly decline legitimate orders. So this is a bottom of the funnel problem. All the things that companies like Redstage does to improve your site, SiteImprove, that what they do is essentially top of the funnel traffic. People are coming to the site, you're getting them to convert. But what if they go through that entire process and at the end they can't check out because of your fraud countermeasures that are in place? So this is a huge problem. 4.1 trillion in global e-commerce and billions of dollars lost simply to combating fraud. But I'm going to explain now a little bit about chargebacks and what you can do as a merchant to protect your business. So essentially, there's two types of chargebacks that merchants receive. The first category is preventable chargebacks, or unauthorized use of the card. Scott had explained an example about how they would use cards from the dark web. People can purchase these for $10, $20, and they get thousands of dollars in limits, and they will essentially go to sites and test them. But once they have access to and know that the card's good, they will use these fraudulent cards to make unauthorized purchases. And a lot of businesses, they simply just write off the losses and they take it on the chin. Another area for chargebacks are actionable chargebacks. These are ones that are called essentially customer abuse chargebacks. These are ones where a person says that, hey, I ordered a red dress and you shipped me a blue dress. I'm going to file a chargeback. I'm not happy with my experience. So that's something called significantly not as described, or SNAD. And these have costs to the business as well. Some of them are legitimate and service related, but some of them are just bad customers that are abusing your policies. So what do you do to fight fraud in the first place, preventable chargebacks? And what do you do to fight actionable chargebacks, things where, like I said, customers may abuse your policies? Kind of expanding out the picture of what does it look like within the average or typical company, what's the break between these types of chargebacks? Generally, about 61% of your chargebacks are going to be the preventable type, ones where people are using fraudulent credit cards to obtain your products. Another type is INR, or that's item not received. This is porch pirates. That's with the advent of Ring and people looking at their doorways. I mean, there's a lot of horror stories now of people just simply not receiving their packages, and that's what this category is. If I make a purchase and someone steals it off my porch, I'm a customer. I just file a chargeback and say, hey, I never got the product. Well, who's responsible for that? The merchant is, because it's a card not present transaction. And as I was discussing before, there are types of recoverable chargebacks, or things that you can do with your own policies, but there are also customers that will take advantage of things such as significantly not as described, or order cancellations, or processing errors. And a portion of that revenue is actually recoverable by the merchant using Signifyd. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So when we're talking about costs to the business, I wanted to give a good example for Magento merchants. A typical Magento merchant that's making, say, $10 million a year. What is the total impact of these percentages as we kind of expand out and say, well, how does this impact your business? Well, as I was saying earlier on, merchants lose about 0.9%, almost a full percent to chargebacks. They lose another percent generally to staff and software to review orders, and those are costs that are essentially lost from the revenue. A larger impact, though, however, is deploying these countermeasures. Merchants typically decline around 3%, some more, some less. Typically decline 3% of these legitimate orders where people have gone through the process of using SiteImprove, and you got a good customer journey, and you make it all the way to the checkout button, the buy now button. 3% of those customers are going to be turned away and get caught in your fraud filters. And so, you know, it's kind of a shame that people focus so much on their customer experience only to turn away a customer right at the end. These customers, you know, it costs money to acquire them, and it's a shame that you have to turn them away at the end of their journey, essentially at the checkout page and after they click buy now. However, with something like Signifyd, there's a liability shift approach. So with Signifyd, we pay back merchants all of their chargeback losses that I described before, the preventable and actionable chargebacks. We essentially reimburse the merchants for any chargebacks they receive. So they shift the liability away from the merchant. With something like Signifyd, they don't pay staff and software. It's essentially a fully managed service. They don't have to spend time on monitoring their fraud. Signifyd charges a small percentage of the revenue rather than having these hard costs. And as well as what we do for merchants is it's in our best interest to approve as much traffic as possible. So they typically get about 3% revenue lift. It's something called an approval rate. If you can ship 3% more products than you could yesterday, why wouldn't you do that? Well, what does that look like? You know, essentially, we're talking about almost $500,000 in costs for a $10 million merchant. However, if they were to deploy something like Signifyd and some of these costs were to go away, they could realize essentially nearly, you know, about $500,000 back to their business between costs and additional revenue from sales that they wouldn't be able to realize without something like Signifyd in place. This is across the board, like I said, for all merchants, some more, some less. We've seen dramatic shifts in the amount of revenue by simply deploying something like Signifyd and checking your orders. So to break it down even further, where does this revenue essentially go, right? The KPIs or the departments are different within some of these merchants. You know, they're held by operations and finance, but essentially, this is an example of a typical fashion retailer, someone who's selling clothing goods. They do have a higher return rate, but as I walk through, you know, they're paying for 100% of this traffic. Marketing is doing spend on Google, on Amazon, Facebook to acquire traffic, and so 100% of those orders are coming in to their system. However, some of those orders are being kicked out by the filters at the processor level. There's little tick boxes in the processor that says, hey, if the billing and shipping don't match, don't process this order. Well, you lose those orders. They don't come into your commerce system. They get flagged by your processor and they never get fulfilled. If you have an OMS system, there could be rules like not shipping to specific countries. Some of those orders are lost there as well. As we described earlier, the fraud countermeasures that people put in place, there's a loss in revenue, generally around 3 to 5%, in fact, of the revenue is declined when it's legitimate traffic because it's thought to be fraud. And that's a large opportunity for merchants to recover this revenue. Essentially, you know, you're starting from 100% of traffic, and your traffic is actually not going through the whole journey here. Now, a typical fashion retailer is going to ship, say, 86% of their orders, and this is before Signifyd. they will pay 0.5% to 0.9% in chargeback losses. And some of those orders are going to be returned. And some of those orders are going to have chargebacks related to customer abuse. Talking about, like I said, bad actors or customers that are serial chargeback filers, essentially, against the company. And these are the losses that merchants experience. You can see there's a big drop off. And Signifyd helps by eliminating fraud chargebacks to zero, reducing abusive chargebacks, and allowing merchants at every step in this process to ship more orders because they're not turning away legitimate orders due to their fraud filters that are in place at the processor level or whatever rules that they currently have in place. That's really the point. How do we maximize revenue for a merchant when people are trying to steal their product? Well, one way is to deploy something like Signifyd. Signifyd has 10,000 merchants in over 100 countries using our solution. Companies as large as Walmart and as small as mom and pops use Signifyd to identify who are the people making purchases on their website. One thing about Signifyd is we have so much data across this network of merchants and through third-party applications that inject data into our system. 96% of the time, we've seen that customer before, and it may be a first customer for the merchant, but it's not a first-time customer for Signifyd because we've seen the purchase history and transaction history of these customers. We're able to, through behavioral data, proxy detection, and a bunch of different data elements, be able to say, hey, this order looks legitimate, go ahead and ship it, it's approved, and hey, if it comes back as fraudulent, don't worry, we got your back. We're gonna cover your costs. We'll pay you back for the chargebacks, the shipping, the taxes, and the processing fees. So, Mr. Merchant, just focus on selling as much as you can. Don't worry about that. But if we tell you no, hey, this is a fraudulent actor, then we don't charge the customer anything. We simply just show them the data and say why they shouldn't ship an order. And that's how we help mitigate fraud and maximize revenue for these merchants when they're using something like Signifyd. Here's an example of what Signifyd looks like under the hood. Here's our console. There are different elements within the console. At the top of the page, there's an analysis. We know how old an email address is. You know, in Scott's example, he said that that these fraudsters were using a script to create new email addresses. Well, we can identify how old that email address is based on transaction history. We could see if it's a brand new email address or how old it is. We could see information about the device and the addresses. There's payment and product details on the page, so you can see that. And this all comes into your commerce system. If you're on Magento, there's a simple plugin for Signifyd, and companies like Redstage can help deploy this in line in your order flow. What this does is it also shows you things such as the order triangle, where these geographies, what are the geographies of where these orders are being placed, and where are they being shipped to. You can essentially find areas for fraud that way too. And these are things that merchants typically, without Signifyd, they look to this type of data. They might use something like a White Pages Pro or a Threat Metrics to try to gather some of this data to make their own decision about whether they should ship a product or not. But when they're using Signifyd, they don't have to worry about that because we're taking full liability for the transaction. So if we tell merchants ship it, it's good, hey, get that sale. If we tell you no, it's not, we're going to tell you the reasons why it's not and why you shouldn't ship it to protect your business. So this is kind of an overview of how Signifyd processes orders. It's a little bit different than most merchants. You'll see that a buyer places an order on your e-commerce store and it goes into your e-commerce platform and your payment processor. Well, we take information from the processor and any information from the buyer, and we ship that over to Signifyd. And it returns with a binary decision: either ship the product, it's approved, we apply a guarantee, and a financial guarantee for the merchant to say, hey, you're going to make that, if you're shipping this product out, your sale is good, you will realize that revenue. Or we say no, decline this order and release the funds. This is a fraudulent credit card, and you're going to get a chargeback. So don't fulfill this order. We're gonna spare you the headache to do that. But we got you covered in either scenario, and that's what helps merchants really focus on their own core business and not have to be fraud experts. With something like this in place, in Scott's scenario, we would be able to see, hey, these are fraudulent orders being, fraudulent credit cards are being used to place these orders, deny these orders, and it could have helped limit some of the losses in that scenario that Scott had described. So one example that recently Magento has come out with a case study on this. It was a cross-border case study. You can just Google Magento cross-border case study. They had a recent case study come out in which they highlighted a company called Structube. They sell furniture online and internationally. What they found was, hey, they were targeted by sophisticated fraud syndicates that didn't know how to stop these fraudulent orders. They had to manually review these orders and put rules in place to combat fraudsters, right? So they're trying to go with the path of least resistance, these fraudsters. And so when they would make a gain, essentially they were able to make a purchase. Structube would have to put rules in place to try to block those non-legitimate purchases. Well, when you do that, you start building walls between you and your customer that actually might get caught up in those fraud filters. And they were losing revenue directly from declining legitimate orders. So they implemented something, they implemented Signifyd, and their results are great. They reviewed 95% less orders than they had previously, so it saved them time and money doing that. But what's really impressive is they had a 5% increase in accepted orders. So what they were doing with creating rules and trying to combat fraud themselves wasn't as effective as simply installing Signifyd on their store. Signifyd was able to increase their orders by 5%. Hey, that's 5% more revenue that they weren't realizing before, while being completely protected against chargebacks. So no chargebacks, 5% more revenue. What merchant wouldn't want to do that, right? If you told me that I can just install an application on my Magento store to get 5% more revenue, I would do that all day long. The return on investment's totally worth it. Mind you, we charge less than 1% on the accepted orders. So it's kind of like if you were to give me $1 and I gave you $5, you would do that until I stopped doing it. And so that's the revenue impact for the business. And here's another case study in Chuku Racing. We did a similar scenario. We eliminated their fraud losses. They were able to accept more orders and no need for manual review. They stopped reviewing cases. They let Signifyd, the fraud experts, essentially decide when to ship a product and when not to ship a product. And what they found was they increased their orders by 6%, and again, with no chargeback losses. So this can be something very valuable for essentially stopping revenue leakage, fighting fraud, and protecting your business. At the same time, increasing your revenue. So I'm going to hand this back over to Donald for closing our session here. Let me change presenter. Coming your way, Donald.
All right, I think we got it. You guys see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, well, I'll just go through really quick and check out any questions that have been submitted during this webinar. If any of you who are attending have questions, please feel free to submit them now, and we'll get them in the next couple of minutes. Below, I put some of the questions that we had from previous webinars, some blogs we've posted about the topics we've covered here today, and things we've heard from customers. So I guess we'll start out. Let's start with Corb. So Corb, how will merchants know if their sites are ADA compliant? Is there, a simple way to figure it out that they can do, or, what's the advice there?
I think a lot of people will tell you that the ADA right now is murky. Does it apply to the internet? Does it not apply? Does it only apply if you have a physical store and a website? But in totality, what we're seeing from organizations, companies, and even from the courts is that there is a prevailing standard that is the same one that we've all been working toward for 20 years. And that is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's been revised a few times. We're on version 2.1 now. And there are some things that can be tested automatically of your website. And those are things that, whether it's SiteImprove or another tool, you can crawl your website and see how do you stack up? What kinds of issues are you finding? Where are the colors that don't match the contrast guidelines? Where are the form fields that don't have labels like we talked about? Where are the images that aren't labeled we talked about earlier? But so much of accessibility is about a user experience. And so that's where manual testing comes in. Just as you would have real people go through your site and place orders and view and compare products, the same is true for accessibility. The only difference is we're going to be doing that while using assistive technology. And so whether you have those tools in-house or you find a partner who can do that work for you, the end goal is to be monitoring your website on a regular basis for accessibility, just as you would be doing for security or quality of the content.
Thanks, Corp. Pete, what would you say some of the warning signs of fraud are that merchants can look out for?
That is a great question because there's many answers. Because the first one that comes to mind is there doesn't have to be any signs. You could be, some merchants, they don't see the signs, and the only way they know is when they get the chargeback, maybe a month or a month and a half later from their credit card processor saying, hey, you sold this product essentially in a card not present environment, and it was a fraudulent credit card. You didn't take actions to stop it, and you're liable, merchant. It's kind of funny, but merchants who sell online, they're liable for this card not present fraud in a way that if I were to walk into a store and use a physical card, well, that's different, and they're not liable for those types of chargebacks because it's a different type of fraud. But there could be some initial signs, for example, velocity rules, people making a lot of different purchases. There's different types of fraud called like account takeover fraud, where people use other people's credentials to make purchases on the site. And it's hard for merchants to see these signs of fraud early on, effectively until it's too late. So the best effective fraud strategy, I say, is to be vigilant at all times and have a solution in place rather than after the fact. If there's things that you can do to protect your business now, turn to the experts, because mid-market merchants on Magento, they have so many other things on their plate. The last thing they need to be is a fraud expert. So go to companies like Redstage, like Signifyd. Put something in place to protect your business against these fraudsters, because it's simply a matter of time. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when for a lot of merchants that they will actually be impacted. And when they are impacted, it messes up a lot of things with their systems. There's a revenue loss for that. So rather than focusing on what are the warning signs for fraud, really what merchants should be doing is focus on how they can prevent it. So when it does happen, they have a solution in place to protect them.
Great, thanks, Pete. It looks like we have another question for Corb. Are ARIA labels helpful for website accessibility, or are those not yet widely used by assistive technologies such as screen readers?
So ARIA labels are another form of alternative text. So alternative text works great on an image, but ARIA labels help us in ways that we don't necessarily always have accessible alternatives. So when we have something like an icon that's that looks like a lightning bolt or looks like a question mark, those are kinds of things that, based on the way they're put on a page, we can't always put an alternative text on them. And so ARIA labels really help with that. ARIA labels are very widely supported, and when used properly, they can be very helpful. One thing that I would call out for you is that there sometimes is an inclination to take something that is visually apparent, let's say a buy now button, and to add alternative text or an ARIA label to that is more descriptive, because we sometimes fear that if I just say buy now button, somebody might not know what that is. So it'll say something like, click here to buy the products and proceed to checkout. Well, that runs into some trouble. First of all, for a screen reader user, I want to know exactly what is on that page, what I'm visually seeing matching what I'm hearing, right? As a low vision user, I'm looking at the screen and using a screen reader. And someone using speech dictation where they're talking to their computer to click on various things or go to websites, they expect those to match. So ARIA labels, yes, are a good thing when used properly and in the right places, but also make sure that if you're going to use one of those, that it matches what is visually on screen.
Perfect. Thanks, Corb. Scott, I know you're pretty passionate about this topic. Can you talk a little bit about what Magento end of life is?
What's Magento? Joke. Hey, got a little laugh. Magento end of life is when Magento 1 end of life is where it will no longer be supported anymore, and it will no longer work anymore.
Thanks, Scott. From what we've been seeing at Redstage, there's a lot of merchants who are still planning to stay on Magento 1. And Magento, when Magento ends support, there won't be, any further security updates or, and we've even seen developers stop developing new plugins for the platform, meaning your old plugins can break and cause more vulnerabilities. And we can see some of the dangers that we've gone through here, whether it's fraud or, hackers getting in or other ways to reduce revenue, break your site, and really cause a lot of havoc online. So that's why we've been pushing for merchants to move to Magento 2, because it's just a safer platform to be on. And with that, I will now discuss our security bundle that we've been working on with Signifyd and SiteImprove and a few of our other partners in the ecosystem. We've really packed everything that you could possibly need to keep your site safe into this bundle. And if you'd like to, collect your offer and get the 1 month free offer, or at least learn a little bit about it, info us at redstage.com before 4 p.m. today. And we'll get you started on the road to learning more about the bundle and help you figure out which aspects are best for your site, recommend different technologies, and tell you more about it. You can also learn more about it at redstage.com/services, and feel free to email us with any other questions that you have. Thanks again to our speakers for joining us today. Look forward to doing the next one.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take it easy.